We're starting in Genesis chapter 12 this morning, and we're making our way to the covenant made with Abraham, but in Genesis chapter 12, though the story of Abraham picks up, we are not yet at the covenant made with Abraham. That doesn't arise until Genesis chapter 15. So we're looking today at the promise that was given to Abraham, and next week you'll find out why I distinguish the promise from the covenant. But I want to begin by highlighting the connection between the covenant made with Noah and the promise and covenant made with Abraham. And that is that the covenant is made with all the nations. That is, it has impact for all the world. In Abraham's day, we're having a separation that begins now as God separates out the descendants of Abraham, the Jewish nation, from all the other nations. But the purpose of that separation is not that God is simply abandoning the Gentiles and the nations. The calling of Abraham is specifically for the purpose of making him a blessing to all the nations, as we see in Genesis 12, 1-3. Now the Lord, Yahweh, appeared to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." Noah and his family became the seed of all the nations that are in the earth. And God was making a promise never again to destroy every living creature on the earth as he had done in the flood. But that should have raised a question in our mind. Well, what will that mean with respect to human sin and God's judgment in the world? He's now promised not to destroy the world again. Well, is the world somehow going to stop sinning? And if the world doesn't stop sinning, is God just going to ignore that? Or does his nature not demand that there be judgment where there is sin? Death is the wages of sin. So there ought to be a question raised in our mind as to how this covenant made with Noah, and as we see is being continued through Abraham to bring blessing to all the nations on the face of the earth, how will that be done? How will it be done if sin persists in the world? And of course there's every reason to believe sin will persist in the world because God said so. In Genesis chapter 8, beginning of verse 13, we read, "In the 601st year, in the first month, the first day of the month, the waters were dried from off the earth, and Noah removed the covering of the ark and looked, and behold, the face of the ground was dry. In the second month, on the 27th day of the month, the earth had dried out. Then God said to Noah, 'Go out from the ark, you and your wife and your sons wives with you. Bring out with you every living thing that is with you of all flesh, birds and animals, and every creeping thing that creeps on the earth, that they may swarm on the earth and be fruitful and multiply on the earth.'" Notice the be fruitful, multiply. This is continuing the work that was given to the human race at the creation. So in the post-flood era, we have something of a new creation. "So Noah went out, and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives with them, every beast, every creeping thing, and every bird, and everything that moves on the earth, went out by families from the ark. Then Noah built an altar to the Lord, and took some of every clean animal, and some of every clean bird, and offered burnt offerings on the altar. And when the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma, the Lord said in his heart, 'I will never again curse the ground because of man, for the intention of man's heart is evil from his youth.'" Now, that's a sentence that seems to carry a paradox involved in it. I will never again curse the ground. Why? Because man's heart is evil from his youth. That just seems to bring together a contradiction. Is God suddenly going to cease to be God and he will not punish? Or is there some other way that is now being hinted at, suggested to us, that God is making a solemn promise that the world's not going to end in judgment, but we're not yet at a place where the sin of the human heart that infects the whole human race is going to be dealt with. So we're presented, one might say, with a wonderful promise that God is not going to allow sin to have the last word in the world. So judgment is not going to be the final act of this world. But at the same time, we're not at a place where sin in the human heart has been eradicated. The flood washed away the wicked, but it didn't wash away the wickedness of the human heart. It was still there. It remains to be dealt with. Now, there's an issue here that I want to mention. I'm not going to deal with it in any great detail. It's an issue that emerges, one might say, without announcement. And you and I read it as unproblematic. And yet at the same time, when it came up in the text, we should have been raising questions. The reason we're not raising questions is that we immediately go to an understanding of this issue that comes up later in the Scriptures. And we immediately read that back into the text, even though the text at that point had not prepared us for that distinction. And the distinction comes out here. Noah offered sacrifice to God. Of what? Of clean animals. We're told in Genesis chapter 7 that when Noah goes into the ark, he's to take 7 pairs of clean animals to every 1 pair of the unclean animals. But by that point in time, Genesis 1 through 6, there's been no delineation of which animals are clean and which animals are unclean. So far as we know, that distinction is now being made for the first time. And when in Genesis chapter 9, after the flood and so on, God says to Noah, I now give you every beast of the field for food, as I gave you the green plants. We perhaps need to read that in a different light than I think we're prone to read it. I think many people, perhaps most, even most commentators, read that as an indication that now, after the flood, we will no longer be vegetarians. Now we can be carnivores. That we were vegetarians up to that point in time. Now we're able to eat meat. Well, that's a possibility. But there's another possibility. When God says, I now give you everything among the beasts, as I gave you the green plants, it may be that what he's saying is, whereas there was no clean or unclean distinction among the plants, now there will no longer be a clean and unclean distinction among the animals. In other words, a distinction that arises within the ark between clean and unclean animals is now being obliterated until the time of Sinai, when it will come back. That the ark is to be filled with 7 times the number of clean animals as there are unclean animals. Well, why? Well, part of the reason is clean animals will be used for sacrifice. Unclean animals were not. It's quite possible, too, that it meant that that ark smelled of barbecue. And then it stopped. And God made a distinction between the clean and the unclean. And of course, we later learn in the New Testament that the difference between the clean and the unclean animals really had nothing to do with the animals themselves. We weren't going to be healthier if we just ate of the clean animals, and we didn't eat of the unclean animals. If you thought that were true, you have a big problem with why the New Testament suddenly throws the gates open and says you can eat all the unclean foods. You can go have your barbecue, go have your shrimp and lobster and so on. It's not that the New Testament is saying, well, now they're saved, they can eat and die from unclean foods. That's not. The clean and the unclean, according to Acts chapter 10, were symbolic regulations given to us to teach the lesson that there are certain things that are acceptable to God and certain things that are not. But it had nothing to do with the animals themselves. Okay? There's no reason why a pig cannot be eaten rather than a cow. As long as it's prepared properly and so on, you can eat pig as well as cow. But it was there to force the Israelites on a daily basis to think through the fact that some things were acceptable to God and some things were not. And so when Peter gets this vision that's dropped down out of heaven of the sheet full of clean and unclean animals, and he's told to kill and eat, Peter says, no, Lord, my lips have never touched that which is unclean. Which, by the way, would be, one would think, an amazing accomplishment for a Galilean fisherman. But his lips had never touched anything unclean. And God says, no longer call unclean that which I've cleansed. And that happens 3 times, and as far as we know, Peter still had not eaten. And while he's pondering this whole thing, trying to figure out, I suppose, was this God or the devil that was speaking to me, suddenly, and then God says, now, there's some men at the door, and they're here for you. And it's not the Gestapo, it's not the Romans. These men want you, and you're to go with them without asking any questions whatsoever. Now, why Peter obeys that when he didn't kill and eat, I don't know, but he does. And he follows that man, and those men take him right into the home of Cornelius the Gentile, and he walks right into that house, and he gets in there, and he finds that God has prepared Gentiles to receive the gospel. And then suddenly he says, now I know. The light bulb goes on. All that matter of foods was there to teach a spiritual lesson about people being acceptable to God and unacceptable to God. And just as he finds out there's nothing inherent in a pig that makes it worse to eat than beef cattle, he now finds there is nothing inherently in a Jew that makes him better than a Gentile. It's a matter of the heart. It's whether God has cleansed the heart of sin. So he now sees that all the food issues had to do with people. And, of course, that's what we're building to as we get to Abraham. In the ark, Noah was taught to distinguish between clean and unclean animals. And in the ark, God was distinguishing between clean and unclean people. The unclean people were being washed away in the flood. The clean people who had believed Noah, who were united with Noah, Noah who had found grace in the eyes of the Lord, and therefore Noah was a righteous man. Those who were united with him were saved from the flood. They were the clean. Not because they were inherently better, not because they had done better in life, but because Noah had found grace in the eyes of the Lord. And God was teaching the lesson of the new covenant already when he made the world anew in the days of Noah. Now, with that covenant that God makes, which will be for all the nations, he gives a sign of his covenant, which is the rainbow, which we've talked about. Now, I'm not going to say anything more about its biblical meaning. I want to talk about the fact that that covenant sign has been co-opted in our day to stand for something else entirely opposite. There's one that flies down the road from my house. And where they fly in your neighborhood, that is the emblem for the movement of the LGBTQIA+. My friends, that is an alphabet of sin. Every single letter in that movement stands opposite to what God intends for the human race. Sex wasn't given to us just as a means of satisfying pleasurable desires or desires for pleasure. It wasn't given to us for that purpose. It's not given to us to decide how it will be used. We will come back to this in greater detail. When we get into the study of the commandments, we come back to the seventh commandment. Sex belongs to the institution of marriage. Marriage between one man and one woman, brought together as God's covenant demands. As God's covenant regulates with the human race. He gave sex to human beings for the purpose of marriage. It doesn't have a purpose legitimately pursued outside of that bond. Everything else outside. That's not just homosexual sin, that's all heterosexual sin. And since we're saying that in the covenant made with Noah, the question has been raised, is when God promises that He's not going to destroy the world again, what's He going to do with human sin? Well, we know He's not going to ignore it. Because we don't get far into the narrative with Abraham before God once again comes in judgment against Sodom and Gomorrah. Now, homosexuality was not their only sin. If you read in the book of Ezekiel, he says this was the sin of your sister Sodom when he addresses the people of Israel. This was the sin of your sister Sodom. She had abundant food and careless ease, but she did not care for the poor and the needy. And when I saw it, I destroyed them. Just think about that sentence for a minute. They had abundant food and careless ease, but they did not care for the poor and the needy. Thus they committed abominations before me. And when I saw it, I destroyed them. Though it wasn't just homosexuality, though that is certainly prominent, also there, visitors came into the home of Lot in Sodom, and the men of that city gathered for the homosexual rape of those visitors. So it was the manner of their sin, yes, but it was also just the sin in that they did not care for the strangers and the aliens that had come in among them. There was a very special obligation that God put upon people in the nation of Israel, and we see it even backed up to the time of Abraham, that they were to care for the stranger and the alien that had come into the land. In the law that Moses gave to Israel, they were to regard the strangers in the land on equal footing with themselves. They had to provide for them. Strangers and aliens were permitted to gather from the edges of the field. I'll just take this one example. You weren't allowed to reap to the full edges of your field. God claimed, one might put it this way, I know this is a very offensive word today, God claimed it as a tax. It was a tax upon you because He had given you a field. And in acknowledgement that God had given you that field, you weren't allowed to reap to the edges of the field because that was there for the strangers and the aliens. And there was another level of tax, that when you did reap your field, you went through the field, you were not allowed to pick up anything that you dropped. If you're gathering sheaves of wheat and whatnot, and you're taking them back to your wagon and so on, and you trip on a root, and half of your pile goes back down on the ground, that is for the poor and the needy. It was in the providence of God that you tripped, and the exact amount that you dropped on the ground was what He was leaving. That's how Ruth was going to be sustained. She was going to glean in the fields of Boaz because the poor of the land were permitted to go there. And they could eat from the wheat on the edges or barley, whatever it was, and they could glean after the reapers, anything that was dropped. And if you remember, Boaz told his reapers, be sure to drop some. You know, most people who own fields wouldn't want their servants deliberately dropping things. But Boaz was a different kind of man. He said, when you be sure you drop some. Because there's a woman back there from Moab, and she is caring for her mother-in-law. And that woman is an example to us all. So be sure that you leave enough for her to take care of her mother-in-law. So In the ark, God is making a distinction between the clean people, the unclean people. He represents it in the animals within it. But then after the ark safely lands and so on, God says, no, I give you everything to eat. He wipes it out for a time. It's going to come back in the nation of Israel, when once again he's going to make even more radical separations between Israel and the land because of all the dietary regulations imposed upon them, which relate not just to certain foods, but other practices as well, how they even kill the meat they can eat, etc. God is taking, one might say, very special pains to make this people stand out from the nations. But that is not because he has now written off the nations. He calls Abraham in order to make him a blessing to all the nations. But that separation is going to be necessary to the accomplishment of the goal. The end goal still means blessing for the nations. The end goal still means the rainbow shines around the throne of God. He intends to make every nation on the face of the earth the recipient of his saving grace. But it will be a separation that is called for to get us to that point. Now, another thing that goes with this that we'll come back to when we get to the Ten Commandments, I mention it here for you to be thinking about as you read. What is bound up in here is that there, in God's purpose for all the nations, there is a fundamental unity among all the nations on the face of the earth. We share with them a common humanity. All the people on the face of the earth are descendants of Adam and of Noah. All of us have one common father and ancestor. Now, we live in a world that makes pretty radical distinctions between races and peoples and cultures and so on. There's nothing more important than that which unites us to all the nations on the face of the earth in our humanity. As we live our lives in the world, there certainly will be a distinction between those who sin more and those who sin less. There isn't anybody who doesn't sin at all. There is certainly a distinction between those who sin more and those who sin less. We don't always appropriately judge which are the worst sins. If you think of Jesus for a minute and his public ministry, with whom did he have the most conflict? Was it the local mafia? Was it it's the Pharisees. It's the people which in that culture were regarded as the most devoted to the law. They tithed mint, dill, and cumin. Okay, they were never led with their pledge cards. They tithed mint, dill, and cumin. But inside, they were full of dead men's bones. And the man who was the Pharisee of the Pharisees, the Apostle Paul, why, he turned out to be the chief of sinners, the worst of us all. Even at the same time, he thought he was the best of us all. So we don't always get it right, but are there sins that are worse than others? Of course there are some sins that are worse than others. If you knew your shorter catechism, you'd know this. Some sins, by their very nature and by repeated aggravations, are worse than other sins. It's far worse to sin 10 times than one time. Sinning one time is enough to separate you from God and bring everlasting judgment upon you. But 10 times that judgment, not in time, in degree, will come upon you if you sin 10 times rather than one time, because God judges us according to our deeds. So some sins, by their very nature, committing adultery in the flesh is worse than committing adultery in your mind. Committing adultery in your mind is adultery. It's sin. It will be punished. But doing it in the flesh is far worse. So yes, there are distinctions of sin to be drawn among us, but not such as to give anyone who would be in a category of lesser sin reason to expect favor from God. There isn't anything about the level of sin in us that makes us more deserving of some other. We are of one flesh and blood. God has, Paul drew this out in his sermon in Athens. He has made from one man, all the people to dwell on the face of the earth. We all have a common ancestor. And we all share with him in a common corruption because he represented us all. Red and yellow, black and white. We're all under the judgment of God for the sin in Adam. I don't know what color Adam was. We now have people of many colors. Quite clearly, living in the world means that Adam's descendants are somehow or other going to come out in various colors. But it doesn't destroy the common humanity that they have in Adam. The family reunion is going to have people of many different colors, so to speak. We are all of one common humanity, and we are all of one common depravity, and we all stand in need of the one way of salvation that God is going to bring through the seed of the woman, through the one who come like unto Noah, through the promised seed of Abraham, because in his seed will be blessing for all the nations on the face of the earth. Back to the rainbow flag. I think that's like waving a red flag before the bull of heaven. We are inviting the judgment of God. In our nation, we continue to tear down the institution of marriage upon which God was building the human race. That's how it's intended to work. But we're living in a culture that is flying in the face of that. It goes all the way to the top, not only of the executive branch, but of the legislative branch and of the judicial branch. Because our Supreme Court justices have come down upon the side that it is fundamental to our humanity to be able to define ourselves as we wish. And if that means choosing to go in homosexual directions, that is your constitutional right. If it means that you decide that you're going to change your sex to be other than you were born, the Supreme Court tells you you have that right. It's flying in the face of the divine provision for creation. And we cannot expect that this will go on forever. When I was very young in college, the Billy Graham Association had a local crusade in my hometown. Now, Billy Graham wasn't coming. All right. We're a small town of about 18,000 in southwestern Pennsylvania in the midst of the coal mines. All right, so we're not going to have the whole Billy Graham organization there. But we had Grady Wilson, one of the associate evangelists who came. And he came to us the year after one of the hurricanes had come in across the Gulf Coast and had leveled a bunch of places. And he was conducting a similar crusade in a small town down on the Gulf Coast of Louisiana. And they were holding the crusade there in a high school football stadium. And like most high school football stadiums, it's got stands on two sides of the field and the end zone is open and so on. Well, at the end of one of the end zones at this football field, you could see down into the red light district of that particular town or city. You could see it. It was well known to everybody. That was the red light district. That's where you went if there were certain types of sin in which you wanted to engage. And during the course of his messages that week, he stretches out his hand and he says, "How long do you think it is that God is going to put up with that?" I mean, he pointed his finger right down there. Well, the answer was 1 week. 1 week later, a hurricane came in off the Gulf and just leveled that place. Just like Noah's flood. He said he'd never been invited back to that city again. But we're inviting divine judgment. And I say inviting divine judgment. We're already in divine judgment. We can't tell the difference between right and wrong, male and female, or anything else in our society anymore. We are bound and determined to make our life worse by almost every legislative act that gets press. We have lost our sense, so God is turning us over into darkness. Now, one more thing about God's judgment related to Noah's flood. He's promised he's not going to destroy the world again. But what's he going to do about sin? Well, there is an additional step taken in the post-flood world. The additional step is that God institutes capital punishment. Genesis 9:6, whoever sheds man's blood, by man his blood shall be shed. Whether of man or beast, he's now going to have animals killed if they take a human life. Violence had filled the earth prior to the flood. We've talked about that. There was violence throughout the world. So what happened in Cain's life, what happened in Lamech, the descendant of Cain's life, has now permeated the world. There is violence throughout the world. That's part of what brings the judgment. This is such a great sin because human beings have been made in the image and likeness of God. So any attack upon the life of another human being is an attack upon God. He takes it very personally. It is that kind of sin that brings about judgment where God deprives people of their life. Now, Cain deserved to have his life taken for what he had done. But the fact that he deserved to have his life taken doesn't mean that anybody else has the right to take that life. It's still for God to decide whether anybody can do anything about it. And in Cain's case, God made it explicitly clear by putting some kind of a mark on Cain that was there to warn off anybody else that if you attack Cain, God will attack you. That if you seek to avenge Cain, God is going to bring vengeance against you 7 times over. Now, whether that was general for how murderers were to be treated, because Cain wasn't the last murderer before the time of the flood. Okay, his descendant Lamech was a murderer, and so on. Whether that was a generalized prohibition against capital punishment from the time of Cain to the time of Noah, I don't know. I just know that in the case of Cain, capital punishment was ruled out. Then violence fills the earth. After God has cleansed the earth with his judgment, he institutes capital punishment. There is part of the way in which he is responding to the fact that the flood cleansed the world of the wicked, but it didn't cleanse the wickedness of the human heart. And so there was still going to be murder in the world. But now murderers would face, one might say, an additional threat. Now, it's not a greater threat because the fact that people can now kill you is not a greater threat than the fact that God will kill you. But there is something that seems a bit more immediate to us. God is now giving permission to human society to take the life of those who threaten the lives of people in human society, who have taken the lives of people in human. So God is now drawing the human race into, one might say, an additional part of his work. At the creation, we were to imitate the works of God. He was a gardener. We were to be gardeners. He had made the Garden of Eden. Adam and Eve were there to till it and to keep it. And they were to be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it. So they were to go out into the world doing the works of God. Doing things that God does, as God does them, for the purpose of bearing his image in the world. God rules over all the creation. Human beings rule over the earth. And we are to do the works that God does. So we're to go out planting gardens with plants that are beautiful to look at and good for food. Why? Because that's what God does. But now God is drawing us into the work of judgment. As God judges sin, so we will now judge sin. We're not going to be able to judge sin to the degree that God does. We can't put people in hell. But God is saying that people may be put to death if they take the life of another person. In fact, that they should be put to death if they take the life of another person. Now, it's very clear that in Genesis chapter 9, capital punishment may be applied only in those cases where life has been taken. God had prohibited that in the case of Cain. God might have prohibited that, generally, from the time of Cain to the time of Noah. God now permits capital punishment after Noah until the time of Moses. And for the people of Israel under Moses, the death penalty will be expanded. It won't just be murderers that will be put to death. It will be adulterers. My wife has always agreed with that expansion. She told me if I'd commit adultery, she would forgive me. Posthumously. Posthumously. So my wife has always agreed with it. So it's expanded to adultery. It's expanded to Sabbath breaking. It's never expanded to thieves. Crimes of property are never treated on an equality with crimes against human life, etc. But there's a great expansion of the death penalty under Moses for the people of Israel. It appears, and I'm just going to mention this now, we'll come back to it when we talk about the Sixth Commandment. It appears that God has restricted that application in the New Testament. It would no longer apply as generally as it did under the law of Moses, though it will continue to exist, because the state does have the power of the sword, according to Paul in Romans chapter 13, and the sword is not for the purpose of paddling people. The sword is an instrument of execution, and God has given to human states power to kill. Just what those circumstances are, we'll talk about later. But the institution of the death penalty is an indication that we have entered into a new era of God's dealing with the human race, in that he has drawn human beings into the work of judgment, as well as into the works of creation in sustaining life, etc. That we will now become partners with God in the administration of his justice, in bringing vengeance upon those who do evil. And in Noah's day, even vengeance unto death for that. All right, those are some loose ends that are kind of wrapping up the covenant with Noah. We'll be stepping into the covenant with Abraham. According to my watch, we've got a few minutes left, so I've been promised there'd be time for questions. So if there are any questions that I can handle, I'll take those for a few minutes and then we'll close. Does it apply to abortion? Yes, it would. That will hinge on whether the Bible tells us anything about the status of the unborn. And I think the answer to that is it does. The Bible treats unborn life exactly the same as it treats life outside the womb. Personal pronouns are used for children in the womb. They are persons. And so just as they are, one might say, under the sentence of Adam from the time of conception, because you can die any moment after you begin to live, so they are under the protections of the sanctity of human life from the time that they're born, and therefore their life may only be taken under the conditions which God specifies. And I think the Westminster Confession is correct in this, that there would be three circumstances under which life may be taken. Capital punishment, self-defense when life is threatened, and just war, which is nothing but capital punishment and self-defense extended to a nation. There's no physical or materialistic basis established that a person born a male is in fact a female. And yet, scientifically, that's now being accepted in medical schools of this land. You know, if a person walked into a psychiatrist's office and said they thought they were a tiger, that person would be judged a lunatic. But if this were a biological male walking in and saying, I'm a female, all the material evidence would be one. But we don't have a basis for sorting that out anymore. It's whatever we think we are, we may be. You know, I could wish I was 7 feet tall all the time I played basketball. The fact of the matter was, I was going to be out there and never get above 6'1". I debated, I think you've heard this story, but I debated this issue out at the medical school with somebody from the ACLU, abortion, that is to say. And then after we had had our debate, then each of us had a time to come back later on just by ourselves to answer questions. And when I went back, there was a woman who was particularly offended by what I had to say. And so she started in on me, and this went on for 10, 15 minutes. And she wasn't making any headway with me. I wasn't making any headway with her. And I had to move this on since I was the guy somewhat in charge. And I said, we're just going to have to agree to disagree. And anyway, in exasperation, she throws up her hand. She says, I give up on you. She said, I just don't believe that any judge ought to have the right to tell a woman she has to have a baby. And I said, well, I'm glad you and I can end on a point of agreement because I accept that. She said, what? I said, I agree with you. I said, no judge should be empowered to tell a woman that she has to have a baby. She said, I thought you were against abortion. I said, well, I am against abortion. Are we back on that? I said, when you talked about a judge telling a woman she had to have a baby, I thought you were talking about a woman that didn't have a baby. But if we're talking about abortion, we're talking about a woman that does have a baby. And now the question is whether the woman who has that baby is permitted to destroy that child. And that's what I don't think ought to be. I said, and young lady, you know that better than I do, because in this medical school, they will treat you how to treat that baby as a patient, provided the mother wants it. But if she doesn't, then that same baby can be your victim. And that's what I think is madness. Well, that's where we left it. I don't know whatever happened to her. I hope she didn't become an obstetrician. In Romans chapter 1, the descent of the human race in turning against God is first of all a descent into the futility of our minds. And then it works out into the dishonoring of our bodies. And we're at a place where we have lost, this culture, lost the ability to distinguish right from wrong, and even male from female. We've lost it. And it's almost impossible to have a rational discussion about it anymore. All right, let's close with prayer. Lord, as we live in a time that is headstrong and going far away, how we pray that you will renew our minds and our wills, that we may be devoted to living out the commandments of God in the age in which we live. Make us bold to suffer consequences when obedience brings persecution. Make us steadfast in the face of increasing persecution. And make us lights to shine in this dark world. We ask in Jesus' name. Amen.